Hi, Dr. Michael McNeil here. Welcome to part 2 of Analytical Philosophy. I'll try and actually get into some Analytical Philosophy now, but I did sort of mention that it's the 20th century is considered the beginning of the 20th century, really considered a revival Analytical Philosophy. Many people think that Analytical Philosophy emerged in the 20th century, and that's not true. People like John Locke and David Hume would very much be considered those in the analytic. They would be considered analysts. They'd be considered people who have a particular view of reality, and so I think one of the clearest distinctions of if you want to try and describe the differences. I mentioned in the last video that out of Kant, responses to Kant was where there was like the intuitive route. And then there's what you would call the Hegelian route, which was Hegel said that the problem with reason is that we've got a too primitive view of reason, and what we need is a far more sophisticated model of reason, and then we'll be able to solve the problems of philosophy, if you like, and far better because we've got a much better model of reason. And if you know anything about Hegelian thought, which is an enormous area in its own right, Hegel. Yeah, in many ways, people would say that if you understand Hegel, then you're just respected. If some people don't believe it's even possible to understand Hegel really fully, and you've got a lot of thought that flows out of Hegel. People, you might say, politically is philosophy. The political implications of philosophy are very interesting because you get people who. Marx's view of history, for example, was basically taken straight from Hegel. The idea that history is flowing towards this ultimate consummation, and so that's if you like the left-wing Hegelians. The right-wing Hegelians, some people would say that the right-wing Hegelians is very much to do with conservatism, and it's not so much fascism. That's different because in many ways fascism and Marxism, that sort of like politics, that extreme left, extreme right. I always find it helpful to think of politics not as left right, but as more as like a circle. And as you go out, you go sort of like do left right, and then they merge together again. So it's more a matter of which word, the more probably pejoratives that different varieties of fascists chuck at each other. Some people call each other Marxists, some of them, but they're basically in the way their political philosophy works and how it works out in practice. They're equivalent. It's simply a matter of nomenclature whether you want to call people fascists or communists. Really, they're in their economics and their basic views, they're actually the same. But that's for another time. So, but Hegel's view, Hegel's, if you know anything about Hegel's sort of basic position, when you hear the words sort of the dialectic, the operation of the dialectic, where you have, say, a thesis, and then there's an antithesis, which is an opposition to us, and then you have some sort of pulling together and reconciliation of those two, and then out from that pops another. So in a sense, the particulars are being pushed together, which was seemingly irreconcilable, but they generate another thesis, and then that another antithesis from somewhere else in nature will combine with these two. And so Hegel's view, and that's probably a very basic view of Hegel, simply because it's really difficult to understand, to describe Hegel simply. But that sort of like idea, if you've ever heard the terms dialectic, thesis, antithesis, and if you consider sort of like Marx's appropriation of that, where he's saying there's this continual battle between in economic terms, there's a battle between, say, the bourgeoisie and the workers, or the elite and the oppressed, and there's this continual struggle and tension, but out of that will emerge some sort of new order. It's that sort of idea. So it's two competing forces, that then there's some synthesis of those, and out of those pops emerges a new thesis, which is then encounters another antithesis, which then combines. And so Hegel said that reason was far more complicated, and the operations of it were far more complicated. And his Hegelianism, the various forms of Hegelianism, for those who rejected sort of like the intuitive view and wanted somehow to maintain the rational view, they became Hegelians, and Hegel reigned supreme almost until they sort of like the cracks started to appear perhaps in the mid 1850s, 1860s in the work of the one of the founders of pragmatism, somebody called Peirce, who in many of the things that he would say in his work would be considered far more analytical in breaking complicated problems down into simple components, rather than with Hegel you're going from the simple components and you're trying to get to a whole, and in Hegel that whole was, he called it absolute spirit, and it would be like it's when all things are reconciled, all the seemingly distinctions between that we experience in reality, they would all disappear, and all the absolute oneness of everything. And he had like a almost like a quasi. He actually considered his philosophy as a updated view of Christian theology. Hard for the people to actually understand that, but he actually said that, well, the Bible and Christian theology was like a low level expression of my philosophy. My philosophy is the high level expression of this, and that's why there was an enormous Hegelian cult as well during the time of his life after, because he was presenting in many ways he was presenting a religious vision, and that, I'm sure that would be an interesting take on Hegel for some people. But his view that eventually everything will come up into come to this place of absolute spirit, and only when everything is known can anything be known. Only when everything is known can any of the relations of reality be properly known. So, which is a dramatic consequence of his way of thinking. So he was saying that you only ever got sort of signposts on the way to reality, a true understanding of reality. You've only got any thesis that you might come up with is going to be tentative until you get to that place of absolute spirit. But the problem is, if you ever got to that place of absolute spirit, all distinctions will be lost, and any individual consciousness would be lost. There would just be one universal consciousness. And when you look at it that way, you see an enormous link with perhaps what you would call the Eastern intuitive view of, it's a bit like the old Beatles song in the 60s when they got involved with the Maharishi in India, and especially with sort of like George's influence, and some of their songs at that point, they say, I am you and you are me, we are one, all together, we are all one. And so the idea that is based on that sort of, you can see how the ideas of Hegel can very, very easily be this sort of it's called monism. It's called everything sooner or later is going to be reconciled in one. The relations that you have between objects in the universe are internal relations. So what apparently individual thing in the world is actually related internally. There's actually some fundamental, for the want of better term, sort of spiritual level, there's a oneness. But many people would say it's not even a spiritual thing. They would actually say it's a physical level. The separation, our apparent experience as individuals is illusory, and there's a oneness to reality. So I think Bertrand Russell, when he was trying to express the difference between his view, or the analytical view, and the Hegelian view, because he said that he abandoned in the 1890s the teachings of Hegel, because he said he was a weak Hegelian in the early part of his career in the 80s. I'm not sure when that was, perhaps 1870s, 1880s. And but he had the real the dramatic turnaround when Moore, G. Moore, is considered the person that his method, Moore's method, his analytical method, led to a big revival in analytical philosophy, and for many at that time a rejection of Hegelianism, the various forms of Hegelianism, and the various interactions with idealism. And so what is analytical philosophy? So in a sense, Russell tried in those big terms. He was saying the difference between our view as analysts of the universe and Hegel's view is that he said, I see the universe as like a pile of buckshot. They're basically mean that's sort of like pellets. So they're all pellets piled up on the counter. And he says, whereas Hegel sees it as like a sticky bunch of molasses in honey. So everything sticks together. So the whole, if you like, reality is all interconnected. Whereas what analytical philosophy says is that they're separate, distinct entities, and they are in a relation to one another. So we're in a relation. We are distinct objects, but we have a relation with one another, and that's the base. That's really the core of analysis, at the core of the analytical tradition. Despite all its differences, there's many people doing analysis, and they come to totally 100% contradictory conclusions, and they fight with one another as analysts. But the analytical method, the analytical philosophy has as its assumptions that there are individual entities and that they are in a relation to one another. Some people might call this, in epistemology you would call this externalism, that that there's what your relationship to knowledge, your relationship to the targets of knowledge knowledge is not something that's coming from some sort of, it doesn't require any internal, like I feel, I touch, I smell, it can be something that's totally external. You can still know something, but it's external to you. It's because you've encountered it at some point, perhaps in the past, or you've accepted it on some other basis. It doesn't require any first person involvement. So that's the thing. So analysis really is talking about a world of external objects. There's external objects out there. Those objects are really out there. That's what you might call realism. The objects are really out there, and that we're in relationship to those objects. And even more so, we have access to those real objects. There's not like this Kantian distinction between the noumenal and the phenomenal. So we're almost over the threshold of actually getting it properly into analysis. So, excuse me, I'll get a little drink here. I actually did sketch something here of the different themes that I wanted to try and include, to make sure I included. The greatest change, in the sense that what really made modern analysis possible was that in the 1850s, 1860s, there was somebody called, I would call him Gottlieb Frege. I think his full name something like Friedrich something Gottlieb Frege, but he's known as Gottlieb Frege, known as Frege. And he was like innovated, made some discoveries in logic, or which paved the way for the analytical mode of thought. Because logic, the theme of the role of logic is primary in any. It's interesting. We tend to not appreciate the significance of logic, the different logics, and how they help in the construction of knowledge, and the implications of actually understanding what we say, and understanding that there's logical relations between the different objects in the words or signs and sentences. So amazingly, until the middle of the 19th century, logic had been dominated by Aristotle and basic Aristotelian sort of like logical concepts or things that were considered Aristotelian, not necessarily just what Aristotle wrote, but the medieval scholastic period. They used the ideas of Aristotelian logic, and so and some of those thinkers, like people like Duns Scotus, phenomenal thinkers. People don't understand that just because they were monks and members of monastic communities that they weren't thinkers. They were, and that's part of the prejudice when people don't really understand. These guys were thinkers. Duns Scotus in particular was an amazing thinker, and you've got Aquinas and but their assumptions and their logic, and when they used logic, was very much they were still Aristotelian in their ideas. And for Aristotle, a declarative sentence, in the sense logic was limited to declarative sentences, and with a declarative sentence, you've got, say, a subject term and a predicate term. So say the mat is green. So your subject is the mat, and is, if you like, the green is green. The green is the predicate term, and all that means is that the green is qualifying in some way the subject term. So that was Aristotelian logic, is based on that relation. Now, what Aristotelian logic couldn't handle was relational sentences which express some sort of relation. So if you were saying the cat is on the mat, the on the mat there's some sort of relationship between, it's expressing a relation of the cat being on the mat, and you can't resolve that into simple subject predicate forms that you have in Aristotle's logic, because it's just not there. It hasn't got that concept of relation. And so, in the sense of the logic itself was very, very limited. Now, one of Frege's, what you can only describe as absolutely revolutionary innovations, was he came up with a logic, we might call it sort of like predicate logic, first order predicate logic or something. But he came up with the quantifier, and it allowed you to express relational sentences which are expressing a relation. They're not just in subject predicate form, but they're relational, so they're expressing some sort of relation. He allowed you to recode those sentences that we write in English or German. He was German, so he'd be writing in German. But whatever language you write, if you translate that into logical symbols, then it doesn't matter then what's that sentence is actually expressing. Any logician could look at those symbols and actually understand what you're expressing, and that was incredibly powerful. That change in the ability of logic, because what that led to was people would say that if you can express in clear logical description particular sentences, that perhaps the philosophical problems that we have are actually to do with the fact that our language is ambiguous. And this is one of the assumptions of analysis, is that philosophical problems are result because of language and because of the ambiguity in language. So the first phase of analytical philosophy was to try and discover this perfect, if you can recode all your, if you like, signs, your sentences, your words, your propositions, in this perfect logical language, then the problems of philosophy will either be resolved, or they'll become clear and allow you to come up with solutions. So this was the first phase of the analytic movement, which was this perfect language. This is very much associated with Carnap. He published this Aufbau, which is like the logical structure of the world. So it's like his Bible, almost. It's his definitive statement of his philosophy. But that's very much that's what its subtitle in English is: the logical structure of the world. And so it's very much based on this idea of Frege that with using these new tools of this logic, which is far more powerful, the logic of the 20th century, the different logics that have flown out of that. There was almost no progress in logic for two millennia, and then suddenly in the last 120 years there's been a lot of work in logic, and different, there's been other logics which have come out, which logic is all about establishing proof systems, and most of them are. I mean, you do get some strange, interesting logic like fuzzy logic, and because normally, in classical terms you would consider something is A or something is B. The law of excluding middles, it can't A or B. Things cannot be both A and B at the same time. Some people look at, say, quantum mechanics and consider that actually some of the famous experiments are the double slit experiment, where two things might seem to be in two places at the same time, and so you get so some people flowing out of that say, well, there's a fundamental indeterminacy and subjectivity in reality, and that's definitely something to consider in a future talk, because if I go off on that, it's such an interesting thing. It's something I put in my book. Again, all these videos, blow my own trumpet for a few minutes, all these videos are connected with stuff which I'm trying to advertise, in the sense, themes which are in the book, and trying to advertise philosophy. So this is, in a sense, to try and introduce you to my thought and where it's going, to try and hopefully you think, actually, even though I don't understand very much of what he said, actually I really want to find out more. As the book's just gone to the typesetter, so the publisher's done all the check, it's gone to the typesetter, but they're saying worst case it might be July of next year before I actually have physical printed copies, but it's in the process of being published, so it's great. Really pleased with that. Passed the format check. They were complaining about the formatting of the bibliography, even though their house style doesn't match any of the other normal styles. They've got about 50 styles in Word, all these different bibliography styles. Doesn't match any of them. It was a strange sort of hybrid style. It's actually quite interesting, because they said, you follow the Chicago model for all your formatting of your text. If you've ever written a book, the Chicago manual style. So there's all these different typographical conventions, and when to use certain length of dashes, and if you've got British or American punctuation rules, well, man, I tell you, it's been fun. But this is all connected with themes and stuff which are in the book. But let's try and get back to Frege. Now, another thing which Frege, one of his amazing innovations was that he said that a concept is like a unsaturated, because he was a great mathematician, and so that was his interest. He believed that you could derive mathematics, pure mathematics, from logic. And now that one of the great one of the great controversies in the philosophy of mathematics and is the status of mathematics, and the status of whether mathematics is just a set of rules which we agree on, say axioms which are agreed on, which are unprovable, but we assume them, and then we develop systems of thought that spring out of those axioms. And that's one view of mathematics. Plato's view of mathematics was almost like those objects of numbers they're existing somewhere else in this, Plato's theory of forms. They're in another realm, and so and what we have in this realm, mathematics was almost. I've heard this quite a few times, that people describe mathematics as like the thoughts of God. So mathematics has this mystical, had this mystical Platonic. There was lots of mystics who looked at the beauty of mathematics, and the mathematics being the language of nature, and there's all sorts of mathematical relations in nature, and when you pull a string tight, that's the basic of music, isn't it? The higher the tension and the narrower the string, the higher the pitch, and when trees grow up, trees you get ones which are like spirals, and you get other ones which are almost like they're what's called binomial growth, and so you get these different that seem to be this perfect these mathematical relations in nature. And so people are saying, well, because they're in nature, because we see them, they can't just be conventions, they can't be just arbitrary conventions or axioms. There's something real about mathematical objects. And number, the concept of number, because they're one of the first people to try and address in the 19th century. There's somebody called John Stuart Mill, who's very, very famous for his political philosophy, but he was one of the he wasn't a logical empiricist, but he was an empiricist, or somebody who was very interested in empiricism, and an empirical view of number. So he's saying, well, actually all numbers are generalization, inductions from our experience. So the number 3, because we have 3 physical things, that's all they are. But somebody instantly points out, well, the concept of irrationals in maths, like pi is like the ratio between the diameter and the circumference of a circle is the number pi, and it's an irrational. And what that means is 3.1457259. It's an infinite progression of numbers. Whatever, I might have gone wrong after the first. At one point, I'd have probably been able to quote about 30 decimal places, but not now. But most people. But it's like it though. That doesn't have any obvious material analogue. You wouldn't. Whereas what Mill was trying to do was offer an empirical theory of number, but it's woefully inadequate. But the amazing thing about what Frege did was that Frege, by asserting that it was based on logic, there's nothing mystical about that. These are just, until you have to justify what your logic is. Why? Because logic in many ways doesn't fit into a materialist view of the universe, does it? You don't go out and look and find a logic out somewhere. Logic is thought, is a pattern of thought. But what was amazing for him is it was saying that assuming that, by saying that's what's called logicism. Actually, is when you believe that mathematics can be derived from logic. The work of Russel and Whitehead in their Principia Mathematica, in which that they published together, that was meant to be a thorough working out from some basic logical principles, the foundation of mathematics, which has an enormous consequence if you can demonstrate that mathematics is derived from just a few foundational logical principles. It immediately gets rid of this mysticism and metaphysical assumption regarding mathematics, if you can get it from logic. So that's why their way of work was very, very foundation and radical. But when you, even though the work was astonishingly impressive, Quine had quite a lot to say about that work. He said he was initially very much drawn to that work, but then you have remarkable figures like Kurt Gödel, and his what are they called? They're called the Incompleteness Theorems, which were in the middle of the 20th century, where he basically showed that you cannot prove some of the basic foundations of arithmetic. You can't generate a logical proof for some basic theorems of mathematics. And so that logicist program of saying that mathematics is merely a matter, can be derived entirely from logic, that in a sense was the refutation of that view. It turned mathematical philosophy on its head. It's probably some of the most groundbreaking work ever. And Gödel was known for his. He believed that mathematics was an expression. It's almost like a reversion to that previous view that mathematics is somehow an expression of the mind of God and of the logic of God. And so, it's not something that can be independently derived from abstract logical principles. So, that's remarkable in itself. That's a remarkable view of mathematics. So let me. I'll pause there again and another 30 minutes. So we've managed to almost get into a little bit of analysis, get into a little bit of Frege. But I want to do more on Frege because there's some of his innovations really opened the door to the analytical revolution.